Bien, écoutez, on est satisfait évidemment, ça correspond à ce qu'on voulait. On ne s'attendait à rien de moins de la part du gouvernement, puis là, c'est fait. Donc, c'est la chose à faire et je pense que la leçon à retenir, on ne doit jamais menacer la sécurité des familles, des parlementaires et des Canadiens en général de la part du gouvernement étranger.
À des répercussions, une riposte de la part de la Chine là-dessus?
On verra ce que la Chine dira là-dessus, mais il reste que de notre part, c'est la chose qui est à faire.
Should it have taken a whole week for this to happen? Should it have taken a whole week, Mr. Paul?
It's been too long. The moment we knew that there's an issue with that kind of situation, it's the first thing our government has to do is to take action. And actually, we have to wait for 1 week, and we don't understand why. But today it's done, so that's perfect. Thank you.
Are you worried about Chinese repercussions?
You know, it's sad it took this long to finally make the right decision, but I compliment the government for finally doing that. It's after pressure from really all parties in the House, but at least it's done.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if you just heard the news, but Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly declared Zhao Wei, the Chinese diplomat, persona non grata. Any reaction to that?
Well, I know the minister was going about this the right way in terms of due process, as she said, and she, at no point have we said any options were off the table, and it's good that she's taken action. We've been clear that throughout our mandate, foreign interference isn't something new that we're talking about. It's something that we were talking about even in the 42nd Parliament when we passed legislation with respect to election interference with and foreign funding of our election cycle. And so, of course, the minister is going to take steps. It's our job as all parliamentarians to look out for parliamentarians, and I'm glad she took the right step. Thank you so much.
Did it need to take a week, though?
You want to speak to the minister?
Okay, thanks.
Je suis extrêmement heureux d'apprendre l'expulsion du diplomate chinois. C'était la seule solution à ce problème. Il était temps que le Canada puisse prendre ses responsabilités envers la population et les députés canadiens et puis agisse en conséquence. Tolérer davantage la présence du consulat ou du diplomate chinois était une honte à la démocratie et à la protection des députés. Pourquoi? Écoutez, on dit souvent on ne veut pas agir parce qu'on avait peur des conséquences. C'est ce qu'on a dit le week-end dernier. Bien, moi, ce que j'entendais quand je voyais ça, c'est que je me disais on préfère subir les conséquences que d'en infliger à d'autres. Menacer la sécurité d'un élu, c'est pas banal et ça affecte directement la démocratie au pays. Donc, je crois que la décision est tardive, mais elle est tout à fait appropriée. Il faut maintenant aller au fond des choses. Nous, on demande depuis le début la tenue d'une enquête publique et indépendante afin de faire la lumière sur l'ingérence étrangère. Ça, c'est un des incidents qui est dans la trame de fond. Mais on doit vraiment aller au fond des choses et faire la lumière.
Est-ce que ça ouvre un nouveau front dans les problèmes de relations diplomatiques entre le Canada et la Chine et où ça va mener?
Bien, en fait, semaine, les gens de la Chine disaient on va aller là jusqu'à la fin. C'est une grosse menace quand même. Mais je pense qu'il est temps que le Canada, qui est un pays quand même du G7, affronte ces situations-là. Puis, à mon avis, le Canada a lui-même créé cette situation-là en n'agissant pas par le passé, en étant faible. Et on en voit les conséquences aujourd'hui. Il est temps qu'on stoppe ces conséquences-là puis qu'on puisse mettre un frein à l'ingérence.
À quel prix?
À quel prix? Bien, écoutez, je vous dirais que là, on attaque la démocratie. On n'est pas seulement en train de dire ça nous tentait ou c'est un truc économique. Oui, il y aura probablement des mesures de rétorsion, mais je pense qu'il faut être prêt à se tenir debout pour nos principes. Et le principe de croire à la démocratie plutôt qu'un régime autoritaire, c'en est un ceux-là.
It was the only option. What do you make of the fact that the Liberals have only done this after the immense pressure of the last week? Do you think they would have done it if this hadn't come to the light?
I don't think so. It was the only option in the views of everybody but the Liberal at that time. I think when you get such a pressure on you, you have to act. You have to draw the line in the sand and say, hey, the buck stops here. And up until now, they weren't ready to do that. They had their own reason, and they were wrong. We are applauding this decision today.
And what do you make of the fact that they wouldn't have done it on their own? What do you make of the fact that it took this much pressure, that it took newspaper reporting for it to come out?
I think the Liberal government doesn't understand international relations to a certain point, and I think they don't understand China. You know, you have to make yourself known in the world and know other countries to better know how to manage international relations. And since the beginning, we haven't seen much strength. Since the beginning of 2015, I mean, we haven't seen much strength in international relations. Changing minister 4 times in such a short period of time is not according a right place to diplomacy.
And what about the vote? This came at the same time as the vote. Your party voted in favor of the Opposition Day motion. Most Liberals, I believe, voted against it, or at least some did. What does that tell you?
Well, they're united as one, but I mean, you may be a lot of people, but when you're wrong, you're wrong. To threaten a Canadian member of Parliament is wrong. We cannot tolerate it's over that line in the sand we should have drawn before.
Do you worry about any type of Chinese retaliation in any form?
Of course there will be Chinese retaliation. They've announced it. So I don't know what form it'll take, but I think that we should, again, stand tall and do the right thing. Giving up to threats is not the right thing to do. At some point, we'll have to face the music, but they should have done it a long time before so we wouldn't get here. Today is the consequence of a non-action for a number of years.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
I just wanted to come out today and give my opinion on the decision that was made by the Speaker just recently. Listen, I think that it is appalling that it has taken the government 2 weeks to do what they should have done a very long time ago. 2 weeks after pressure from all parties in the House to register the Chinese diplomat as person non grata. This is unacceptable. Taking care of Canadian safety, making sure that every member in this House can do the job that they need to do is vital. And frankly, my concern is that we have information about this particular diplomat. We have information about attacks that have been made against Mr. Chong and his family. We don't know if there are others. We don't know if there are other examples. You know, there are members of the Chinese-Canadian community who have been warning about interference, been warning about intimidation for decades. And so the fact that we are just getting this action now is appalling.
Can you just address the fact that they only took this action now after it was reported and not when they first learned about it? I believe at least 2 years ago in 2021. Mm-hmm. What do you make of that?
Well, I think, how can parliamentarians feel that this government is acting in their best interest when the government sat on this information for 2 years without taking action and only chose to take that action once there was significant political pressure being put on them by members of all political parties?
And the NDP are in an interesting spot. You're supporting the government through the supply and confidence agreement, but you're also deeply critical of them on this. How do you explain to your constituents how you are doing both things at the same time?
Well, I mean, I am still the opposition. I'm still an opposition member of this parliament, and I will continue to hold their feet to the fire. So we will be demanding that there be an independent public inquiry into interference. We will make sure that the Canadians are secure in knowing that their democracy is being protected, that the democracy of Canada is being protected. You know, I sit on the Canada-China Committee as well, and I will say that we have heard from witnesses. They have been telling the government, both Liberal and Conservative governments, for decades that this intimidation has been happening. So we will continue to make sure that the government does what they have to do. I think this is an example of that. You know, we've been pushing the government to do more, to make sure that Canadians are more secure in their democracy. Today, the government took a very small step. It can't be the last step. It can't be the last step this government does to protect our democracy, to make sure that members of Parliament from all parties can actually do the work that they need to do.
So how far do we go? Because China is going to retaliate and the government is going to feel that it needs to do something to defend whatever. How far do we go? Where does it stop?
Listen, this is on Canadian soil. These are Canadian parliamentarians. These are Canadians that feel that their safety is at risk. And the safety of Canadians, the ability of parliamentarians to do their job, has to be protected. That is a very bare minimum that we expect from our government, that they will protect the safety of Canadians, that they will ensure every parliamentarian, regardless of which party they represent, is able to do their job and that their family is not being threatened. I don't think there's very many Canadians in this country that wouldn't agree that that is vitally important. This is happening on Canadian soil.
What does it say about the competency of the government that they didn't act on it on their own, that they didn't see it even, it appears as a problem on their own until other parties and other people told them it was?
Yeah, it's a concern. I mean, I want to see I want to see proof that this government is taking this seriously, that they are recognizing that even the perception of a threat to our democracy is very, very dangerous because it makes Canadians worry that our democracy is not strong, is not able to withstand. And I think our democracy is strong. I do think that we actually have a very strong democracy in Canada, but I do think the government needs to do everything they can to reassure Canadians that we're protecting
about the government that they didn't?
At this point, I feel like the government has not been near forthcoming enough with information. They've not shared the information that they should have with parliamentarians. They have not been strong on how they've responded to this, and I think it's problematic. I think this is why we need that public inquiry to find out, get to the bottom of this, find out what went wrong and what needs to be fixed so that these problems can't happen again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oui, parce que c'est comme en fait.
Oui, une tag team. Alors, le gouvernement a enfin agi aujourd'hui en déclarant diplomate en question chinois persona non grata, mais la réalité, c'est qu'ils auraient pu agir depuis longtemps. Ça a pris énormément de pression du grand public, des partis d'opposition, enfin que le gouvernement agit. Mais il faut dire que ce n'est pas suffisant non plus. Il faut agir et aller plus loin sur ces questions-là. On va bien sûr avoir en Chambre un débat qui vient de commencer sur la question de privilège de M. Chong. Mais en plus, l'MPD a porté une motion en Chambre il y a maintenant 5 semaines pour mettre en place une enquête publique face à l'ingérence étrangère. Le gouvernement, à date, n'a rien fait là-dessus. On espère bien que le rapporteur spécial, M. Johnstone, va effectivement mettre en place cette enquête publique, mais ça prend ça au plus sacrant. L'évidence est très volumineux. Il faut que le gouvernement agisse. Dites-moi donc, M. Julian, le fait que le gouvernement ait pris tant de temps que ça avant de décider d'expulser M. Weijo, ça dit quoi à propos des priorités du gouvernement?
Mais ça indique, comme dans tous ces dossiers, le gouvernement a plutôt une tendance à vouloir mettre les choses sur le tapis. On a vu ça à chaque étape, il y avait une nouvelle révélation. Le gouvernement semble dire, mais c'est pas grave, on n'a pas besoin d'une enquête publique, on n'a pas besoin d'agir. Maintenant, je pense que c'est très clair dans les yeux du grand public canadien, il faut agir, il faut prendre des mesures. Cette mesure-là, aujourd'hui, est une mesure tardive, mais il en faut des autres et on espère bien que le gouvernement va agir.
Est-ce que le gouvernement avait peur des représailles et si oui, est-ce qu'il avait raison d'avoir peur de ces représailles-là?
Mais c'est une question d'ingérence dans la démocratie canadienne. Ce n'est pas une question de peser. On sait très bien que le régime va répondre, il n'y a aucun doute là-dessus, mais il faut envoyer un message qui est très clair que notre démocratie nous est précieuse et qu'on ne veut pas, on n'accepte pas l'ingérence, on n'accepte pas l'intimidation d'un député, peu importe le parti. On n'accepte pas qu'un gouvernement étranger, peu importe de quel pays, s'ingère dans notre démocratie. Alors, de faire ça plus rapidement aurait envoyé un message plus clair. Effectivement, le gouvernement agit aujourd'hui, mais c'est juste la plusieurs étapes qu'il faut prendre.
Ça a pris trop de temps?
Ça a pris trop de temps, mais enfin, ils ont agi.
What does this show you about how Canada's relationship with China needs to be recalibrated?
I think there's a lot of things that we need to reflect upon. And you may have asked that question to Heather McPherson, so she has left. But pour moi, je pense que s'il n'y a pas d'autres questions, je vais aussi tirer mon référence. Merci. Merci.
Hello, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. At this moment, Albertans, including Indigenous communities living in northern and central Alberta, are facing a critical threat. As of noon today, 103 wildfires were burning in the province, 29 of them out of control, while 21 are being held, and 57 are under control. Ça, c'est 103 incendies de forêt qui brûlent dans la province. 29 d'entre eux sont hors de contrôle, 21 sont maintenus, et 57 sont sous contrôle. The Alberta Emergency Management Agency has reported that about 30,000 people have fled their homes. The Prime Minister and the Premier have spoken. It was a constructive conversation. Le Premier ministre et la Première ministre de l'Alberta ont eu une conversation constructive aujourd'hui, and the request for assistance from Alberta has come in, and Minister Blair will have more information on that. So Minister Blair, Minister Hajdu, and MP Shahal and I are here with a clear message that the Government of Canada is here, and we stand ready to help with whatever support is needed to keep Albertans safe. En français, je vais répéter que le gouvernement du Canada est là et nous sommes prêts à apporter toute l'aide nécessaire pour assurer la sécurité des Albertains. La ministre Hajdu pourra également nous dire un peu plus sur les mesures que nous avons prises afin de soutenir les communautés autochtones confrontées à la menace et la réelle perte des incendies de forêt. Minister Hajdu will also share with us the measures that have been taken to support Indigenous communities threatened and affected by the forest fires. Avant de céder la parole au ministre Blair, je tiens à remercier personnellement tous les premiers intervenants pour le travail qu'ils ont accompli afin d'assurer la sécurité des Albertains et de gérer les incendies de forêt dans toute la province. I want to say to all of the frontline workers, you are the heroes of this province. I want to thank you for all that you're doing to protect life and the livelihoods of Albertans. And just let me say that you have my and our government's deepest thanks and gratitude. Minister Blair, could you please share with us a little bit more about what's next and what our government is doing to help Albertans?
Thanks, Randy.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Bon après-midi tout le monde. Let me begin, first of all, by announcing that this is Emergency Preparedness Week in Canada. It's an annual awareness event that encourages Canadians to be aware of the potential risks in their communities and to take the steps that are necessary to prepare for them and to be ready to be safe. The devastating wildfires and floods that we're seeing right across the country remind us why preparation is so important. And as Minister Boissonnault just mentioned, there are currently over 100 active wildfires burning in the province of Alberta. There are about 60 wildfires in British Columbia and about 15 in Saskatchewan. Over the past few days, we've been working very closely, in particular with the officials in Alberta, through our Government Operations Centre and their Provincial Emergency Operations Centre to assess their needs, to offer federal resources, and to help them manage a very challenging situation. Earlier today, as Randy mentioned, the Prime Minister has spoken with the Premier, and we are in the process of receiving a formal request for federal assistance from the province of Alberta. I have been in many conversations with my counterpart, Minister Mike Ellis, earlier today and throughout the past weekend, and our officials have been fully engaged working to identify the appropriate resources and mobilizing those resources to deliver them as required by the province of Alberta. I've also had a number of conversations today with the Canadian Red Cross about establishing a donation matching program. We've also been reached out to Alberta and that have been impacted by these wildfires, and we'll have more to share later on today about the particulars of that program, but we're all working together to make sure that people impacted by these fires have the resources and the support that they will need in order to get through this. In addition to the wildfires in Alberta, we are also, of course, closely monitoring the flooding in Ontario and Quebec, and in Manitoba, the fires, as I've mentioned, in Saskatchewan, in the Northwest Territories, and of course in British Columbia, which is experiencing both due to high temperatures and fast-melting rivers. If federal assistance is required, it will be delivered when and where it is required, and to the Canadians who have been forced to evacuate. And as Randy mentioned, close to 30,000 people in Alberta have been forced from their homes. Know that you are in our thoughts and that we will be there to support you with the response, and we'll also be there with you as we recover from this very difficult event. And I also want to take the opportunity to offer my personal thanks to all first responders, firefighters, and emergency personnel. They have been working tirelessly through the weekend to keep Canadians safe. We are grateful for their selfless service, for their fellow Canadians, and we will also be there to support them. I want to thank you all very much, and I'll now turn it over to Minister Hajdu. Patty.
Thanks very much, Bill. And Randy, as my colleagues have said, this is a very frightening and concerning time for Albertans, and there are about 15 First Nations that are significantly impacted by the wildfires. Most people have been evacuated. They've left behind family assets and infrastructure and belongings. And so my heart goes out to everyone who is experiencing this incredible dislocation and fear during this really really difficult time. Indigenous Services Canada is working directly with the First Nations affected, with partners, including the Government of Canada, to coordinate and ensure that evacuees and communities are well supported. I've spoken with 2 chiefs already where the greatest urgency is in place. Both Chief Conroy Sewepagum of the Little Red River Cree Nation and Chief Sunshine of Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation reiterated Canada's support to make sure that community members are well taken care of as the community both supports members and tries to protect any remaining infrastructure that is currently still intact. I also had a conversation with my Albertan colleague this morning, Minister Rick Wilson. Obviously, he reiterated that although there hasn't been any loss of life, there's been just astronomical infrastructure and other losses, and reiterated our commitment as the Government of Canada to continue to work with the province of Alberta as well in both the immediate and the long term. Right now, the focus is, as I said, on evacuation, on the safety of the evacuees, and getting as much fire prevention effort in place, like cut lines and barriers where possible, so that we can protect what remaining infrastructure does exist. Indigenous Services Canada is also mobilizing a lot of different teams, nurses who are helping with reception centers and healthcare services and home care needs, environmental public health officers who are assisting with assessment, and mental wellness teams that are already deployed in a number of locations and have a variety of different capabilities for counseling or other kinds of information or system navigation. Jordan's principal teams that are working to make sure families and young people continue to get their very specific needs met. And then, of course, the coordination of the various different hotel spaces and other spaces where evacuees can stay and where we can provide those services to people on site. So we will continue to be working closely with our partners, First Nations partners and provincial partners, to make sure that as we get through this crisis situation, people have what they need to get the support that they need during this very difficult time. And I'll just reiterate my thanks, as my colleagues did, to the first responders and the firefighters, many of them volunteer firefighters, many of them First Nations firefighters that are trained within community and that are out there right now doing their absolute level best to protect homes and communities. Thank you.
We will now be taking questions.
Minister Blair, perhaps you could just provide a little more specifics. What do you mean by additional resources? Like, what does that look like visually? Are you just in a state of conversation right now?
No, ma'am. Our Government Operations Centre and our personnel in every federal government department, so Indigenous Services Canada, Public Safety, Natural Resources, Environment, Canadian Armed Forces, have all been at the table, and we've been working with the province of Alberta throughout the entire weekend. This afternoon, we've just received, and I don't have the actual letter in front of me, but I've had a number of conversations with my counterpart, Minister Ellis. I know that they are concerned they need additional firefighters. Now, there is a national organization called CIFC that has coordinated firefighters coming in from the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, but it's very clear that the fire situation and the number of fires in the areas that are being impacted is going to require additional firefighter personnel, and so that's part of the request for assistance. In addition, they've spoken to us about the need for strategic airlifts in certain communities that need to be evacuated, for heavy engineering equipment, for dealing with some of the infrastructure and even the fire breaks that need to be put in place. There is clearly a need also been identified for additional policing resources, and so we're working with, and Minister Menachino and Public Safety will be working with the province in order to make sure that the RCMP have sufficient resources available on the ground, and of course the coordination with the very many services provided through Indigenous Services, because with these types of events we often find that First Nations are the most significantly impacted because of the interface between their communities and these wildfires, and so the displacement and evacuations are particularly impactful in those things, and that's in those areas, and that's one of the reasons Indigenous Services is fully engaged. And then finally, we also recognize that there are people who are going to incur extraordinary expenses as a result of evacuation or other disruptions to their lives or their work, and so we're working with the province and with the Canadian Red Cross to make sure that trilaterally and together we make sure that the resources are available to support those people through this very difficult time. It's all hands on deck, and all orders of government and civil society are working together to make sure that this works for everybody.
Can you give us a sense of timelines? When are we going to see that additional aircraft? When will we see possibly additional human resources, whether it's soldiers or RCMP on the ground? When can we expect that?
And of course, the process whereby the province asks for help is we have a rather robust, well-established program of requests for assistance, and we now have that document from the province. But the work on that began, a number of days ago. Our officials have been working very, very closely together. Though many of those resources have been mobilized over the past few days, we believe we'll be able to act on the requests from the province certainly as quickly as possible. But we know many of the organizations and federal departments responsible for delivering those resources have been getting ready for the past few days. Thank you all very much.
I'll ask another question.
Okay. Then.
How do we know that there's going to be, for the families that are evacuated, for the people that might require compensation in terms of insurance costs and things like that, how do we know that there will be less bureaucracy? There has always been in the past, in terms of natural disasters, whether it's flood relief or whatsoever, that there's always that concern that in terms of compensation, it is slow and it's full of red tape.
Well, there's two parts of compensation. One of them deals with the immediate response, where people they're out of pockets. They need a place to stay. They need to maybe pay for a hotel room. Close to 30,000 people either have been displaced or are at risk of being displaced from their communities, and all our agencies and departments have been working with the province to facilitate making sure that those people have a roof over their head, that they have access to food, water, and other health services, and that they receive the support that we need. Those things happen very quickly. And one of the reasons and it's worked very well for us, by the way, in British Columbia, and even during the Hurricane Fiona that we experienced last year, where the Canadian Red Cross works usually bilaterally with the federal government, sometimes trilaterally with the provinces. And in this case, the province, the federal government, and the Canadian Red Cross have been working together to put together a program that will enable us to get the necessary funding out to people very quickly. Secondarily, though, we also know that there's a fair bit of damage that is caused by these events to people's homes, to their communities, to their businesses, to their farms, to the forests in which many of them work. But there's also some significant infrastructure damage as well. And we have a program called the Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangement. It's administered, designed, and implemented by the province. And there are expenses that they are eligible to then claim from the federal government, and that's one of my responsibilities. We work very closely to ensure that money gets to the province in a timely way, but it follows an assessment of the damage where the receipts and a determination of those costs and eligible expenses are submitted to the government, and then we provide that funding to the province. One is an immediate response, one is long-term to help them through the recovery.
I might just add on the First Nations side, in fact, just over the last year or so, the department has revised the Emergency Management Assistance Program for First Nations communities so that it is much more flexible and much more rapid, building on this, the learnings that we had in COVID, actually, that when communities are enabled with a certainty around the kinds of financial supports and other kinds of supports without having to worry about, submitting documents before getting that support, that they actually can take much more rapid action to protect families and infrastructure. And so as I spoke with both chiefs, they were very pleased to have that kind of ability to move quickly and mobilize resources, conduct evacuations, and support families with the variety of different needs that you can imagine families might have in those moments.
Thanks, everyone. Bonne journée.
Bonjour, Peter Julian, leader parlementaire du MPD. Qu'est-ce que les conservateurs sont en train de faire aujourd'hui? C'est ce qu'ils ont fait depuis des semaines. Depuis des semaines, la sécurité publique essaie de bloquer le projet de loi C-21. Et maintenant qu'on en parle des policiers à travers le pays, ils ont demandé les mesures qui sont dans le projet de loi, effectivement pour les armes fantômes, pour fermer toutes les échappatoires qui existent présentement pour les fabricants et les importateurs, et aussi pour faire en sorte que les victimes de la violence domestique sont plus protégées. Ce sont tous les éléments importants. Les conservateurs bloquent ce projet de loi et c'est insensé, étant donné l'importance de le faire adopter. Alors, bien sûr, avec ces motions-là, on trouve ça important de faire adopter ce projet de loi au plus 50, puis on prolonge les heures, bien sûr, pour le considérer. So the now are blocking moving forward on Bill C-21. Now, Bill C-21 doesn't have the Liberal amendments anymore that were presented before Christmas. Those amendments, the NDP pushed hard for them to be withdrawn. They're not in the bill. What is in the bill is action that law enforcement has called for to crack down on ghost guns, which are increasing anecdotally in some parts of the country up to 100% a month. These are the number of seized weapons, ghost guns, that are untraceable. Law enforcement has called for this, and inconceivably, the Conservatives seem to be siding with criminals rather than siding with the important public policy that would allow law enforcement more tools to crack down on these criminals that are using ghost guns. The measures in C-21 also take action against the manufacturers who are trying to get around and use loopholes around existing legislation, provide protection for victims of domestic violence. These are all important provisions. And yet the Conservatives for weeks have been blocking committee and are refusing to allow the bill to be considered. And so it is important that the bill go through all of the steps, and that's why the increased number of committee hours, sitting till midnight and capping the Conservative speeches, 20 minutes per amendment, these are all reasonable things in order to get the bill through.
Avec cette annonce de près de 400 millions de dollars pour contrer la violence par arme à feu, vous n'avez pas l'impression que le gouvernement essaie de faire oublier que son annonce de la semaine dernière par rapport à C-21 laisse tomber les groupes comme Police se souvient, les gens de la Mosquée de Québec, les gens qui ont été victimes de violence par arme à feu?
Mais là, d'une part, on trouve ça important quand on prendre l'action à la frontière, ça c'est certain. Mais il faut dire, la coalition pour contrer les armes à feu, la coalition des médecins canadiens aussi, qui veut protéger contre les armes à feu, ils sont très positifs face à ces 21. Alors, c'est pas vrai que tous les groupes sont contre, c'est le contraire. Il y a beaucoup de groupes qui nous encouragent à faire adopter la loi 21 le plus tôt possible, étant donné les forces que ça amène contre les armes à feu fantômes, pour contrer les échappatoires qui existent pour les fabricants et les importateurs, ce que des groupes comme Police se souviennent demandent depuis toujours, de protéger les victimes de violences domestiques, et aussi d'établir une définition technique qui, à partir de maintenant, à partir de passage de projet de loi qui va faire en sorte que les gens soient plus protégés. Alors, c'est important d'annoncer de ce matin, mais il faut dire, c'est encore plus important de faire adopter le projet de loi. Et on souhaite que ça soit fait de façon le plus rapidement possible.
Donc, le fait qu'on réduise les débats à 2 séances, pour vous, ça tient la route?
Mais là, depuis des semaines, on a eu les conservateurs bloquer des réunions additionnelles du comité. On a eu aussi des conservateurs qui refusent de laisser des amendements passer, y compris la définition technique. Il faut dire, j'avais fait une estimée en comité la semaine passée, vous l'avez peut-être vu, que les vitesses que les conservateurs ont adoptées, le projet de loi sera adopté par le comité en octobre 2024. Alors, on ne peut pas attendre une année encore. On a besoin de le faire adopter. Les policiers sont très clairs aussi, et les protections pour les victimes de violences domestiques, la fermeture de ces échappatoires et aussi la réalité des armes à feu fantômes exige qu'on le fait adopter. On n'attend pas une année et demie encore.
Can I just ask you, can you clarify? So, I think you addressed this last week in committee that you believe the Conservatives are filibustering on Bill C-21, and I think you said it would go till 2025 or something.
No, I said October, and then with a pregnant pause, and then I said 2024. That was the rhythm that the Conservatives had set up.
And so, can you just clarify, so the NDP will support, can you say clarify what the NDP will support? You'll support time allocation in committee on Bill 21, and that means it will all get voted on this week?
We support, first off, an expansion of the scope to confirm, the House of Commons can confirm scope on this legislation. The ghost guns are vitally important. Law enforcement has been calling for it. We need to ensure that scope is confirmed, as well as the other measures around scope.
that we believe that at this point, because I'm proposing tomorrow night that we sit till midnight at Committee 2, that 24 hours of committee consideration is more than enough to get through the amendments. And the Conservatives just need to stop filibustering. 20 minutes per amendment is sufficient. Conservatives spent 5 hours on an amendment that was 7 sentences. And I'll just remind Conservatives that under the Harper government, we had 1 minute per amendment on things like the softwood lumber sellout. It cost us thousands and thousands of jobs. And when the Conservatives complained that they only had 24 hours to confirm or look at a 7-sentence amendment, we used to get 500-page omnibus legislation from Conservatives that we had to debate within 24 hours. So the Conservatives have been hypocritical all along. On this, they really need to get where law enforcement is, which is adopting this bill, getting through the amendments, which we'll have ample time to do this week if they agree to the extension on Tuesday night, and we have extensions later in the week as well, and then bring it back to the House for the final debate, and then it moves on to the Senate.
So it would be 24 hours of debate over the next 3 days in committee, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or also including last week?
No. That would be this week if they agree to my Tuesday night. You'll recall last week I proposed a 20 hours sitting this week. They refused that. The week before, I proposed 20 hours. Last week, they refused. They refused systematically. If they agree to my proposal for a Tuesday night sitting, that will be more than 20 hours, 24 hours in addition to the hours we've already spent.
But just so I'm understanding, are you able to get this through the committee with majority support, or do you need a unanimity?
For the committee?
For the time allocation in committee.
Well, if it's a motion of instruction from the House, then the committee is bound by that.
Okay, and so
regardless.
that vote in the House is today?
No, that vote in the House would be later this week, probably tomorrow, but it depends on a number of things procedurally. So in the course of this week, there would be a vote, and then subsequent to that, additional committee hearings.
Okay, so there's only going to be 3 committee hearings this week if the Conservatives, in the very unlikely event, agree to your idea of sitting till midnight 3 days in a row.
There could be 3 days, yeah. 3 days to midnight, so that's another 25 and a half hours in addition to the hours we've already spent over the last 2 weeks.
But that only happens if they agree, and otherwise it has to be a vote in the House to force the committee to comply. And that is not a unanimous vote.
Yes. So what I propose in committee, if it's adopted by committee, would extend 1 day. The other 2 days, if the motion passes in the House of Commons, would be mandated by the House of Commons to the committee, so the committee is obliged, regardless of how the committee feels, to take those sessions.
And why are you the one proposing to speed up a Liberal bill in committee? I mean, I'm wondering if you are concerned about how deeply intertwined the NDP appear to be with the Liberals forcing time allocation. You're saying the Conservatives were worse, but I don't recall the NDP in past parliaments being huge supporters of time allocation.
We are in favor of time allocation when there's a public interest that needs to be followed. And in this case, we have, on the one hand, a marked increase in the use of ghost guns across the country that law enforcement has indicated is a massive increasing problem. 100% increase in some parts of the country over the course of a month. On the other hand, Conservatives basically stalling the committee consideration of the bill at this point to sometime in October 2024. I mean, when we talk about a public policy imperative, it's important to make sure that we're actually considering this bill, doing the amendments, and getting it through the House. Otherwise, if you take the Conservative model, again, with a marked increase in the use of ghost guns across the country and not having the legislative or legal provisions from law enforcement to be able to counteract that or tackle that use by criminals, what would we be doing if we waited another year? It would be irresponsible, to my mind. And so that's why we believe we need to proceed.
And so if you don't get unanimous support in the House, you have the votes you need to force it. Sorry, if you don't get unanimous support in the committee, you have enough votes between the NDP and the Liberals to force it through the House to force it.
A committee instruction takes precedence on the committee. So if the committee doesn't agree to the additional hours, the House instruction would mandate the committee.
And your comment on scope, I thought last week the committee voted in favor of it being in scope. So why do you still need the House to... I assume you mean the scope, the amendments are in scope.
So the committee can make a decision around scope. If the committee makes a decision around scope, it is still subject to a decision by the House or by the Speaker. You'll recall around the Liberal amendments, we'd raised the issue of scope. The government had no provision to have the House of Commons confirm the scope that they had provided in those amendments. So the Speaker would have ruled, and would have ruled in the absence of that scope being confirmed by the House of Commons. In this case, the scope is being confirmed by the House of Commons, so the Speaker would rule positively because the House of Commons has confirmed the scope. I very rarely get in-depth procedural questions, so I thank you for that. No, I appreciate that. Yeah. I appreciate that. Normally I talk procedure and all the journalists just walk away. And today it's great to have some questions.
How did it go from the NDP challenging the scope of the amendments in December to now viewing them as being in scope?
We're talking about two different sets of amendments.
Yeah, but they are the same topics.
They
have different content, but they're the same
we're
topics,
talking different content, right? And again, if scope is in question, if the House has not confirmed the scope, then the Speaker is normally obliged to rule on that basis. We support the amendments that are being brought forward on terms of scope, and particularly provisions around ghost guns are vitally important, so confirming the scope also means that the Speaker has received that message from the House of Commons. But we're talking about two different issues.
But just to get super in the weeds, doesn't that mean then that the NDP just supports scope when they support the content of the amendments? Like you're supporting just completely changing scope of a bill when it suits your policy objectives.
It's more complicated than that. And again, I'm delighted to have this procedural discussion.
Everybody else is too.
I saw some people yawning in the back there. But in terms of scope, when a bill is presented and it has a narrow scope, the Speaker will rule on that. If there is question of scope or something that goes beyond what is clearly part of the scope of a bill, it's really up to the House of Commons to make that confirmation. So in a sense, it depends on what the evolution of the bill is and whether people have seen that there are additional public policy imperatives that mean that the scope needs to be amended. In this case, ghost guns. I attended a presentation with the Surrey RCMP, and their concerns about the use of ghost guns and the fact that there are no laws that effectively deal with this growing proliferation was a real concern that has come up subsequent to the presentation of the bill last year. And so I think in this case it's wise to confirm that scope that includes ghost guns in this bill.
And on to the contents of the amendments, in particular around the creation of this new or renewed committee to advise on what guns to ban, is that the NDP's expectation that through that committee, some of the guns that were on the 482 guns that were on that list that was revoked could actually end up being banned.
Our expectation is that there is full consultation, and our concern is that Indigenous people, that hunters, that farmers, and as well as people who are concerned about firearms in this country, that they're all together under one roof, making that recommendation. The problem, or one of the problems with the amendments that were tabled last year, is that there was no consultation. We certainly saw that from the reaction of the Assembly of First Nations and other groups.
But my question is it the expectation that through that committee, some of those guns could end up being banned? Is that one of the options on the table?
The committee would be making recommendations to the minister, and we'll see what they recommend. No, on a whole variety of issues related to firearms, and so this is something that we felt was really important to be set up again. That consultation process is important, and it was what was missing last year.
The question of banning guns, right?
It could be a number of things, including classification. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
AUKUS overall, I mean, we'll start at the beginning. We've been excluded on the nuclear sub-portion. What do you make of the fact that we're not involved in that?
So I think it was a big failure on behalf of Justin Trudeau and the Liberals for not having us part of this from the get-go. This is the most exclusive military defense agreement to happen in our generation, and they definitely lack trust in this current government of Canada. You know, it's more than just a submarine deal, right? And by not even being part of the submarine deal, our defense industry has missed out on huge opportunities to benefit from providing everything from propulsion systems to engineering to other navigational systems that are going to be put on these submarines. It's a huge project in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and Canada's not at the table.
Do you think our allies would be willing to let us come into a deal like this just on kind of half of it and not the full deal?
No, I think you're either in full or out, and they also it's pay to play. So Canada's been a laggard in defence spending. We know that. They let $2.5 billion lapse in the last year. That's disappeared and will never be available to our armed forces again. The Liberals have lacked the political will to go out there and make the investments and ensure that we can deal with a more dangerous world. The Indo-Pacific strategy lacked a robust military posture in the Indo-Pacific, and that's something that we need to reconsider. So Canada should be a part of it. Whether or not Canada can be a part of it based upon the current government, their lack of investment in our armed forces, as well as their inability to make decisions on replacing our Victoria-class submarines in a way that will ensure that we can patrol both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, as well as our Arctic maritime domain.
These are three of our closest allies, the kind of people that you would expect Canada to be able to come to any kind of agreement, defense, economic, whatever it may be. Why do you think in the first place they didn't want us involved?
Look, the track record of our current Liberal government has been embarrassing. They've embarrassed us in the Indo-Pacific on the international scene. Justin Trudeau continues to talk, as we've seen in the leaked papers from the Pentagon, that they refuse to make the investments in NATO, never mind expand that to ensure that we're making investments in the Indo-Pacific region. We know that because the Liberals took so long to make a decision on a thing like Huawei and deal in a responsible manner of foreign interference within Canada, how can you invite someone to the table that is not prepared to take on the increasing interference and aggressive behavior of the regime in Beijing?
Awesome. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Good.
Thanks, guys. Can we ask you about that Liberal resolution to regulate online information sources? How comfortable are you with that?
Well, you know, I'm really comfortable with when Liberals gather together and they decide to have a vigorous debate and to talk about policy that had been developed either at the riding level and then at the province level and then now at the national level. It's a great policy to discuss and debate ourselves. So let's see what happens.
So you're comfortable with limiting the publication only to material whose sources can be traced? That's something you're comfortable debating?
No, I'm comfortable debating it. Yes,
so
I am.
How do you feel about it?
Well, you know, I'd like to hear a little bit more about pro and con, what the upsides, what are the downsides. But it's something to debate, and it's well worth having a good debate. It's like the whole. It's like the whole. No, désolé. It's like having the whole debate about misinformation, disinformation. It's well worth having those debates.
Vous allez voter quoi sur la motion conservatrice qui va être mise aux voix après la période des questions?
J'ai aucune idée. Vous m'informez de. Je ne sais pas la motion de la conservatrice.
Sur l'expulsion de diplomates chinois, on demande aussi de créer immédiatement un registre d'agents étrangers.
Mais tout d'abord, on va établir. Le ministre a déjà établi qu'on va établir un registre des agents étrangers. Des agents étrangers, je devrais dire. On va avoir la chance de débattre cette question-là. Par rapport à l'expulsion, écoutez, j'aimerais m'assurer que c'est la bonne personne à expulser.
Le consul, la personne qui est au consul chinois, c'est ça l'inquiétude pour vous, c'est de vous assurer que ce soit la bonne personne?
Je veux que ce soit la bonne personne, qu'on est certain de ce qu'on fait, parce que il faut expulser des diplomates, c'est pas quelque chose, une décision qu'on prend à la légère, c'est quelque chose qui est très sérieux, parce qu'on sait forcément que quand on va faire ça, ils vont faire la même chose. Alors, on va être certain de nos faits. De rien.
Démographique francophone au Canada, mais la décision pour les personnes qui arrivent au Québec, c'est une décision pour le gouvernement provincial au Québec. Alors, j'ai l'habilité pour choisir des personnes, pour mettre le niveau d'immigration pour tout notre pays, mais la décision au Québec est pour le gouvernement de Québec.
Avez-vous un malaise avec l'angle avec lequel c'est abordé? Ça fait peur, là, la une... le Québec est pris en étau dans le Canada, tout ça.
Bon, c'est possible pour identifier les personnes avec les compétences linguistiques dans le monde entier qui veut d'arriver au Canada. La possibilité pour obtenir la résidence permanente, la citoyenneté du Canada, c'est incroyable. Il y a beaucoup de personnes comme notre ministère, comme mon ministère, a utilisé les événements pour promouvoir l'immigration du Canada pour recrutement francophone pour le Canada. Nous trouvons qu'il y a beaucoup de personnes avec les compétences essentielles pour notre économie et aussi avec les compétences linguistiques. La situation au Québec, incluant l'habilité pour choisir les personnes avec les compétences linguistiques, et pour le gouvernement du Québec, il y a un accord avec les responsabilités et c'est possible pour le gouvernement provincial pour choisir des personnes et mettre le niveau dans les formulaires.
Oui.
C'est OK?
Oui.
Formulaire?
Oui.
OK. Formulaire? OK, merci. OK. La province a l'habilité pour choisir plus de 60 000 personnes, plus le niveau courant, pour augmenter les personnes qui parlent français. Et nous envoyons proche de 700 millions de dollars pour l'intégration et francisation au Québec. Et en additionnel, c'est pour nous, dans le gouvernement fédéral, pour assurer les poids démographiques de francophones partout notre pays continue d'augmenter.
Mais sur la couverture exactement, on entendait des élus comme Alexandre Boulris dire c'est une une d'extrême droite, ce genre de choses. C'est intolérant, cette couverture. Vous en pensez quoi?
Non, c'est intéressant parce que quand j'ai des conversations avec les personnes qui est le député avec le Bloc, par exemple, il y a des bonnes personnes, les critiques et une amie comme moi, mais c'est possible juste pour avoir des concerns pour les besoins de protéger la culture française. Mais mon point de vue, et c'est possible pour augmenter le nombre de nouveaux arrivants en général et augmenter le pourcentage de les nouveaux arrivants qui parlent français aussi.
Ça vous choque pas?
Oui, j'ai la preuve. Juste l'année dernière, c'est le plus grand nombre de nouveaux arrivants dans notre histoire. Et c'est le plus grand, pas juste nombre, le plus grand pourcentage dans notre histoire aussi, après les statistiques est disponible. C'est essentiel de continuer d'augmenter le nombre de nouveaux arrivants francophones parce que c'est seulement possible pour moi d'augmenter le nombre en général si les communautés francophones en situation minoritaire ont un avenir au Canada. C'est une part clé de notre identité culturelle. C'est essentiel pour protéger la langue officielle de ce pays. Mais ce n'est pas impossible pour obtenir les buts pour augmenter la population et augmenter le nombre de nouveaux arrivants francophones aussi. Les buts et les deux est possible au même temps.
Merci.
There was a motion at the Liberal Convention that talked about limiting the publication of journalistic material only to whose sources can be traced. Is that something you're comfortable with the party pursuing?
Look, I think the party membership is going to host debates and votes on whatever the party membership sees fit. I want to make sure that everything we do as a government is compliant with the Charter, including the right to free speech. I think it's very important that I don't tell you guys what to cover on, and I think it's very important that nobody else does either. You guys in the press play an essential role in protecting our democracy. I think we need to pursue people and their ability to actually have faith that what's being reported is information they can rely upon? Sure, but I don't want to be in the business of telling the press what they should say about me. I think that's an uncomfortable position.
Okay, thanks, folks.
Thanks, everybody.
Essentially regulate online information sources.
Oh, I was thinking you were talking about the one on citizens' assemblies. I saw that one.
Okay. But did you see that motion?
No, I'm afraid I was working so hard all weekend I never had time to clue into the Liberal Convention, just the electoral reform motion. I mean, regulating...
What did you think about that, the electoral reform motion?
I think it's very strong, and I was disappointed to see the Prime Minister has already rejected listening to his own party. So I will be asking about it in question period. But regulating online information sources, I haven't seen the Liberal motion, but the solution to regulating disinformation online, malicious information and slander, is simple. There is no such thing as a platform. all of these operations, all these multinationals are publishers, and they should be held to the same basic legal, and there's massive amounts of jurisprudence on how you handle disinformation and slander being published. The publishers are responsible, and there's no such thing as writing an anonymous letter to the editor that slanders somebody. Our print journalism for centuries, I guess, ever since we've had print journalism, has included a requirement of knowing who it is you're publishing and not publishing things that are promoting hatreds. So rather than try to regulate online information, I think we need to step back and recognize that we made a mistake thinking that this was sort of innocent fun online brought to us by Mark Zuckerberg. This is pernicious, undermines existing journalism, and it creates a profit source for foreign multinationals, undermining domestic journalism, and that solution covers everything, because you can't regulate it to keep up with it. I don't think.
But essentially, you're saying that we should go through the courts, right? But I mean, we already have the courts, and look what that's doing. It's not doing anything.
Because these publishers are treated as a different category. They're treated as if they were platforms and not publishers. Once we clarify that they are publishers, then the law applies to them as it would to any other publisher.
Do you think the government should expel the Chinese diplomat over the Michael Chong situation?
Absolutely. If we know that diplomat was the one who was involved, yes, absolutely.
And how will you vote on the motion today from the Conservatives?
I'm voting in favor. But I do think it's quite plausible that both major parties in this matter are both correct. Sending information to the Privy Council office doesn't mean the Prime Minister saw it. Sending information to the National Security Advisor does not mean the Prime Minister saw it. We have to bear in mind that until we have all the facts, jumping to conclusions is a poor idea. So I support the Conservative motion. I think we need a full inquiry. But I don't believe that these two positions are mutually inconsistent. Certainly during Michael Warnick's time as Clerk of Privy Council, I felt very sure that he had an ear to SNC-Lavalin that wasn't necessarily being shared with others. Privy Council office and PMO are different operations, and the National Security Advisor's operations also may involve a real wall between them and the Prime Minister's office. And until we know that, I don't jump to conclusions.
If the Liberals and the government vote against it, what kind of message do you think that sends to China and other authoritarian regimes?
I think it's a bad message. I think this has become overly partisan. The debate in the House has been, if any of you've tuned into it, extraordinarily unpleasant and does a disservice to democracy. So I can understand why the partisan impulses of every Liberal will be to defeat a Conservative motion. Stand back, read it, consider what Canadians expect, and find your way through to voting for it. And that starts with being able to have people who vote for it, like me, keeping an open mind. I am not voting to say the Prime Minister lied to anyone. A motion like that, I would vote no. But a motion for transparency, to get to the bottom of this, to expel the diplomat who clearly violated the Vienna Convention rules for legitimate domestic conduct of diplomats, no problem at all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.